500 years ago, a young theologian, Dr. Martin Luther, came up with a series of points which he wanted to be discussed in his university. The tradition is that he posted these on the public notice board of the university, which was the church door in Wittenberg. Whether that actually happened or not is a matter of dispute among historians, but that the end of October 1517 is a crucial turning point in the history of Christianity in the West is not in dispute. Luther, in that action of proposing a series of points for discussion, initiated perhaps the greatest academic seminar in the history of Christianity, and one which has lasted almost to the day 500 years. It seemed appropriate to us to gather our experts in the field of the history of the Reformation and the impact of the Reformation, and to hold a seminar here in this university to discuss what the Reformation means today, what the memory of the Reformation means, and what is the effect on us as theologians and historians of looking back to those events of almost 500 years ago. Now, the person who is almost Mr. Historiography of the Reformation at the moment is my very eminent colleague, Professor Alan Ford. Alan, no one has thought more about the remembering of the Reformation than you. Would you like to make a contribution to us?
I think the first thing that hits you about the Reformation...
Alan, would you like to come here, because we'll get a nicer view of you.
Okay. The first thing that hits you about the Reformation when you look at the way in which its history has been written is that what it did was create a great divide. It created almost from the beginning two different historiographical traditions, one Protestant, one Catholic. And those two traditions went their separate, polemical and very hostile ways for the next 200 to 300 years, and in some areas they're still fighting it out. The main problem for the Protestant Church was a historical one, because what Catholics did, quite understandably, was ask that difficult question, which was, where was your church before Luther? And what they were trying to say was that the Reformers came out of nothing. If the Reformers had hit upon the true Reformed idea of Christianity, why on earth had it taken them 1,500 years to realize it? What the Catholics said was that they were basically heretics. Even worse than heretics, they were heretical bastards because they couldn't find their antecedents going back to the earlier church. And this immediately set the Protestant Reformers on a huge historical enterprise, which was to try and find the antecedents of the Protestant Reformers going back to the early church. And what they did was they set out a template for Protestant history, a really powerful template for Protestant history, because it's one that if you deconstruct many present ideas of how people view the church, you find it's still being shaped by them today. And that template was founded upon the idea that the early church was pure. Not, of course, true, but the early church was the perfect church. What you had to do as a Christian was return to the Bible and return to the early church, those twin sources of authority and purity. And what the Reformers did was they set out to trace the way in which the true ideas of the early church and the Bible had descended through church history to the Reformers in the 16th century. And that was a bit difficult, because what they were saying was that in the later medieval period, the church had gone wrong. It had become corrupt and abuse-ridden, thus requiring the Reformation. And even more, they said that it had gone wrong because the church had been taken over by Antichrist. Very strange concept for us. The Protestants believed that the apocalyptic books of the Bible contained prophecies, so books like Revelation, bits of Daniel, Thessalonians, contained prophecies about what was going to happen at the end of time, and that what was happening in our time and what had happened in history. We consign those prophecies to some far distant future or sometime safely in the past. They said this is happening now. What they said was that from the year 600, Antichrist had grown in power. In the year 1000, Satan had been freed from his millennial binding contained in Revelation chapter 20. And that from roughly 1100 onwards, the papacy was taken over by Antichrist. What the Protestant church therefore had to do was to find a way round that corrupt church for its ideas and doctrines. And they did it by tracing them through quite diverse medieval, often heretical groups. Bizarre groups such as the Cathars, the Hussites, the Waldensians, which they used to give them a legitimate historical and doctrinal ancestry. This template, which was produced by the Reformers, is still very much the idea that many people still retain today. That what the Reformation was about was not a forward-looking Reformation that would adapt to circumstances, but a backward-looking one that looked back to what had gone before and tried to get rid of later accretions in order to return to that early purity. Now, as we'll see as we go on discussing that, there's much more to the Reformation, but just initially, I'll leave you with the idea that the Pope is Antichrist, and that justified the Protestant Church. Quite a strange concept to us, but one that was absolutely believed by the early Reformers. Thank you.
One of the aspects that Alan has brought out is this whole question of heresy and orthodoxy. And I think that's my cue to invite Dr. David Gehring, who is belonging to our Department of History, to come and speak to us. David.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on a couple of the aspects here Professor Ford brought up about the Antichrist and notions of orthodoxy, notions of we're right, you're wrong. And as the 16th century unfolds, particularly into the second half of the 16th century, we enter a period when increasingly different Christian groups are writing more and more confessions or statements of their own belief. And in the process, what historians have called this process of confessionalization means that a lot of these doctrinal borders start to harden. We have an increasingly firmly defined Lutheran church, particularly by 1580 in the Book of Concord. We have increasingly defined Protestant groups in England, in Scotland, in the Swiss cantons, and elsewhere. We also have an increasingly well-defined, or defined in any way, post-Tridentine Catholic Church as well. Now, these confessional statements, whether it's in English or in German or Latin or otherwise, oftentimes these confessional statements would include the word credamus, we believe, right? We believe this, we believe that. These are positive statements, we might say. But oftentimes these confessional statements also included the word condemnamus, we condemn, right? So there's an implicit, or rather an explicit, negative element going on here as well. And the definition by opposition, to some extent, in theological terms, then could have very significant effects in the social context and then in the political context. And here we're entering increasingly wars of religion and wars of religious ideology. Okay? Now, how do we think about the wars of religion or differences of religious ideology in the 21st century? Do these things still matter today? What challenges do religious ideologies of the 16th century, what challenges do they pose today? Now, Professor Ford broached the question, does it still matter? Can historians end the Reformation? This is a question that has been brought up recently at a 16th century studies conference. Well, I would say that, at least in my own country, in the United States, since September 11th, 2001, religious ideologies have been inflamed in a way that they hadn't been previously. There had always been religious differences before 2001, but since 2001, in a political context and in a polemical context, divisions across the Abrahamic religions, I think, are stronger maybe than they have been in quite some time. We have particularly vitriolic and vociferous Christian groups condemning different Islamic groups and so on and so forth. And oftentimes this goes back the other way as well. And oftentimes these condemnations happen without a full recognition or a knowledge of whom they're condemning, or the variety of Islam, the variety of Christian teachings, and so on and so forth. Now, what can we learn from the 16th century that might help us in some capacity here in the 21st century? Well, I think that one might not necessarily only need to look at the stark definitions, the boundaries of the confessions as be-all, end-all boundaries, but rather look towards maybe the more ecumenical voices. Look more perhaps towards those who were teaching ethical Christianity rather than rigid doctrines of Christianity. And I have in mind here a gentleman by the name of John Dury in the 17th century, a well-known ecumenist, a well-known ethical teacher of Christianity, who emphasized that Christian groups, Protestant, Catholic, or otherwise, should emphasize their commonalities on the fundamentals of Christianity and cast aside the differences of detail that divided Christian groups. This was a person, Dury, who had wide international contacts and tried to see things in as cosmopolitan a view as possible. So putting aside what he might say were parochial concerns of detail in theology, but rather looking at a broad context of what the different Christian groups may have had in common. So thinking about the challenges of the Reformation, what they pose today, and how the Reformation still matters, I'd say that on the one hand, yes, we do have very, very strong differences of opinion and very strong confessional divides in the 21st century, just as there were in the 16th. But we also do have other voices in the Reformation, those who are looking to overcome these divides and emphasize the humanity we all share. Thank you.
Thank you, David. One of the themes that you brought up was that we not only look back, but we realize that in the looking back, we're dealing with our own identity. And that brings us to our third speaker, and I'm not actually sure how to introduce her because we know her as Dr. Frances Knight, but I know that she's very soon to become Professor Frances Knight. So, Dr. Professor, sounds German, doesn't it? Can you look at this question of our remembering an identity?
Thank you. Well, as you know, I don't normally get out of bed much before 1800. So my focus is going to be very much looking at the question that was posed, the challenges which the Reformation poses for us today. And I'm going to do this in a twofold way. First of all, by looking at the challenges which it poses in the outside world, by which I mean the world outside the churches. And secondly, I'm going to look more specifically at the challenges that it poses for people who are operating within the perspective of the Church of England. So I'm very interested in David Gearing's point about the sharpening of religious ideologies since 2001. And obviously that is true in Britain as well. But I think the story of the Reformation and Protestantism is not one that has become sharpened actually in that period since 2001. I think it's other types of religious ideologies which have emerged in a sharper way. It strikes me actually that in the outside world, these days one rarely bumps in to the Protestant Reformation. And I think that's because the generation of people who were educated or indoctrinated, depending on which word one wants to choose, with a Protestant, nonconformist perspective on the world, is essentially a generation that's passing. Many of those, however, who were born in the 20th century did have that experience of being shaped by the free churches and a Protestant evangelical view, and sometimes also, of course, that being a perspective that came from the Church of England. Anybody who learnt to read on this island in the period from the late 50s to probably around 1980, which is of course a lot of us in this room today, almost certainly read Ladybird books. Am I right? And the Ladybird books, as you may remember, had a history series. Most of those were written by the most influential historian of whom you have never heard, Lawrence Dugard Peach, who wrote on a whole variety of topics, and in doing so created a Protestant history for children to absorb as they learnt to read. So the titles included Elizabeth I, Cromwell, David Livingstone, John Wesley. I could go on. I have wondered if there had been a title in the series called, for example, Erasmus, Humanist and European, how different things might have turned out. But I am actually quite serious in terms of wanting to point to the influence which that culture, Ladybird books of course were very inexpensive. The idea was that one's parents might purchase one every week, drop it into the shopping. That culture of introducing, shall we say, children into British history and its heroes and some heroines. Florence Nightingale featured in the series as well, as I recall, and Elizabeth Fry, had a significant impact. And then, of course, also that generation of people who have now also passed into the grave, people of the generation of Tony Benn, a very prominent Labour politician, whose mother was, in fact, the founding president of the Congregational Federation, Margaret Wedgwood Benn, and quite a significant theologian in her own right. And obviously that influence, that Protestant influence on Tony Benn was very, very marked. And as he moved through life, he moved into a position of a kind of very small c Christian agnosticism. If I think of my own father's generation, and Ben and my father would have been the same generation, it's really quite significant that my father is a man who had a Methodist childhood, but thought his way out of religion probably by the time he was in the sixth form, and had committed himself to a rationalist and scientific outlook on life, actually was able to access the English nonconformist tradition when he was organising my mother's funeral, and wanted to have a rewritten feminist version of He Who Would Valiant Be sung at her funeral. Then, of course, there is if I can be very contemporary, the Brexit conundrum, and a very interesting piece of research that has emerged just in the last few weeks from Linda Woodhead at the University of Lancaster, which shows, apparently, that members of the Church of England were apparently more likely to vote for Brexit in the referendum, sorry, it's a bit of a slip, in the referendum of June 2016, and that Roman Catholics, unsurprisingly, were more likely to vote Remain, and the hierarchy of the Church of England was more likely to vote Remain. So that I haven't managed to explore this research much further than what I've heard reported in the media, but I think this is an interesting line of inquiry. The Reformation, of course, was the first time that we tried to leave Europe. So that's the world outside. Thinking about the Church of England, and I'll do this perhaps a little more briefly, the point I really want to make, I think, is that the Church of England is still, to some extent at least, looking at the Reformation through the lens of the 19th century and through the 19th century church parties. The Oxford movement, of course, which emerges from the 1830s and is an open repudiation of the Reformation, emerges from within the Church of England, within the University of Oxford, openly repudiating the Reformation and promoting all sorts of views which were hostile to it, not just as a religious phenomenon, but also seeing it as a socio-economic and socio-economic disaster as well as a religious one. So the most famous quotation from the Oxford movement on the subject of the Reformation would be Hurrell Froude's much quoted observation that the Reformation was a limb badly set that needed to be broken again in order to be righted. And also, of course, that sense, and this is a view which one still hears expressed in some places, including some places quite close to this one, that the Reformation unleashed a form of rationalism that was ultimately very destructive of Orthodox Christianity. So the fact that the Oxford movement has, in a whole variety of ways and different levels, actually shaped the way in which the Church of England is today, I think means that there is quite a complicated process of unpicking that needs to be done as we look through the 19th century lens. And then at the other end of the theological spectrum within the Church of England, there are, of course, the self-consciously Protestant movements that were set up initially to oppose the Oxford movement. So the Protestant Association, the Church Association, the Protestant Truth Society, organisations that were intended to defend the Protestant principles of the Reformation within the Church of England. And for this group, their heroes were people like Bishop J.C. Ryle, the first and overtly Protestant Bishop of Liverpool, and people like William Joyce and Hicks, who defended the prayer book in 1928 against revisions that would have taken it in a more Catholic direction. And that tradition within the Church of England still exists in the form of the Church Society, who see themselves as upholding the principles of the Reformation in what they would see as a timeless and unchanging way. Thank you.
Francis mentioned the notion of the principles of the Reformation, and I know that's one of the themes that our fourth speaker, Dr. Simeon Zahl, is going to address. And he's also the only one of our speakers who's probably reaching his theological apogee at about the same time Martin Luther did.
Well, thank you. I think I want to speak about the Reformation and its legacy today from the perspective of a theologian, a modern theologian, constructive theologian, and how are ideas in particular that are from the Reformation still affecting theology and debates within amongst Christians today at the kind of intellectual level. And I think it's very clear that we're still very much dealing with the legacy of the Reformation. And I think two of the most interesting things that have happened in theology in the last 30 or 40 years have been kind of large-scale attempts to extricate theology from assumptions and interpretations that go back really to Martin Luther. Just very briefly, one of those is in the New Testament studies, the new perspective on Paul, some of you will know, a rereading of Paul through the eyes of his time and really in light of Judaism of his time rather than through Luther's spectacles. At least that's how it's presented, and that's produced enormous discussion, but it's been a long, you can see that as an attempt to sort of extricate contemporary academic inquiry into the New Testament even 500 years later from Martin Luther's powerful, if many think problematic, vision. Another one is in my own field of theology. We spend an enormous amount of time arguing these days about the nature of salvation, and in particular to say that this old Protestant courtroom forensic salvation where you're saved because God looks at you in a courtroom and sees Jesus instead of you and you're acquitted on that basis, that great classic image associated with Protestantism, that's been found wanting in all sorts of ways and is being replaced by emphases on salvation through incorporation into the Godhead in some way, participatory salvation. I think in both cases it's not always that explicit, though it's sometimes explicit. What's really happening is an attempt to extricate ourselves from what are seen to be problematic legacies of the Reformation. What I really want to talk about today is, so in the David referred to definitions by opposition, and there's a lot of interesting debate in the 19th century about what is Protestantism, because really it was sort of a debate about what is modernity, and there was an association between Protestantism and modernity back then. But there was the idea there were two things about that. You distill what's interesting theologically about the Reformation into a formal principle and a material principle. The formal principle is the Scripture principle. So what people meant by saying that the formal principle of Protestantism is the Scripture principle is the idea that the kind of norm, if you want to know if something's right, if you want to check your doctrine, if you want the boundaries of Christian practice and Christian thought are always have to be established in relation to what Scripture says. The second, the material principle, was the doctrine of justification by faith. And by this, people more or less meant the kind of animating heart, the really radical core idea that was new in the world, in a way, coming out of the Reformation, was a very radical idea of the nature of salvation, that it's completely not dependent on human action or cooperation, that on the one hand, human beings are so flawed they could never contribute to their own salvation. It's a very pessimistic view of human nature on the one hand. On the other hand, a great kind of optimism about this radical grace of God that saves even those who fight against the salvation coming to them. Now, I think it's very interesting how the fate of those two principles. So I think the Scripture principle has become massively blurred since the 19th century. It's much less of a clear distinctive of Protestantism for a number of reasons, partly from the side of Roman Catholic theology. There was an opening, especially starting in the 1940s, to historical criticism of the Bible on the one hand, and on the other, Protestants are tired of their historical criticism of the Bible and are trying to recover pre-critical forms of theological interpretation, to remember that the Bible can be usefully interpreted through analogy and not just through its literal sense, and this kind of thing. And also an emphasis on the way that Scripture works in practices, in liturgies, in shaping imaginations, not just as a deposit of ideas. So from both of these sort of, what in the 19th century were these two sides, you have a blurring in the direction of each other. So I think it's a lot less clear than it was 100 years ago that the Scripture principle is a continuing definitive feature, at least theologically, of Protestantism. I do think the material principle remains strange and radical and unusual. I mean, it's almost an unbearable principle that's constantly being maybe rightly, but sort of domesticated. That do human beings really contribute nothing in their relationship with God? Is grace really so unilateral that it just cuts off all of our actions, our attempts to do things? And that we're still kind of wrestling with the radicality of that idea, which Martin Luther at least believed that he'd found in the theology of St. Paul. A third thing that I just want to mention briefly that's interesting about theology in the Reformation today is the way that the growth of Pentecostal Christianity, hundreds of millions of Pentecostal Christians who didn't really exist in that form just 100 years ago, 115 years ago. The question of, is Pentecostalism Protestant? It's a very experiential form of Christianity. It has an individualism that seems Protestant in the focus on experiences of the Holy Spirit, but it's also deeply communal and focused on communal worship. It has a high view of Scripture, but nothing like a Scripture principle in the 19th century sense. And there's very little of the justification by faith material principle. So is there something new going on? Is Pentecostalism a third thing, or a fourth? But that's not really Protestant anymore. It's its own thing, although historically it comes out of Protestantism. I think that's an open and interesting question. The last thing I just want to conclude, by asking, is there one theological question that the Reformation leaves us that's very active and interesting today in Christian theology? And I think it's the question. It's in a way an age-old question, but that of how to maintain and some of these very powerful and kind of radical Protestant ideas about human nature always being kind of worse than you think, about reason, which Luther called the greatest of all the things that was created, and yet has this sort of tilt towards the perverse in it, that it's not as reliable as we would wish. And that's I think a powerful kind of principle. But how can you maintain that and perhaps the justification by faith idea with all its unusual sort of creative power without evacuating the created world of meaning? Because the problem with these principles is that if your salvation is completely through this unilateral action of God, then none of the stuff in the world matters. Nothing that you're really doing matters religiously. Zwingli there's a quote from Zwingli on baptism, but that expresses this principle. For God alone, he says, baptizes with the Spirit, which is how salvation happens. God alone baptizes with the Spirit, and he himself chooses how and when and to whom that baptism will be administered. So Zwingli is taking to its extreme but obvious logical conclusion, a Protestant idea that objects don't matter, the ritual you do, the liturgy, the context, the community, the actual water, none of that matters. What matters is just, is he sending his Spirit or not? And that's it's almost an unbearable principle that Protestants have retreated from repeatedly, but they always kind of have in the back of their head. But the problem is that potentially evacuates the created world and our practices of meaning. So how do you hold together, on the one hand, maybe some worthwhile insights about human nature and about salvation without making the world flat and meaningless? So, thank you.
Well, thank you to our four speakers who've each made their pitch. And now it's over to you.
Thank you. I suppose this touches somewhat on what Francis was saying and something on what Simeon was saying as well. I'll declare my hand and say most of my learning on the Reformation comes from Eamon Duffy, so that sort of situates me within a particular stream of learning there. Something that he talks about in Voices of Morbarth, which is the analysis of church warden records from the village of Morbarth, going from pre-Reformation through the Reformation. He notes that in the church in Morbarth, before the Reformation, there were lots and lots of images of saints which had particular guilds attached to them, and people would keep sheep to raise money for the guilds, for example, and lots of people were involved, and many women were elected to run the finances of these guilds for the saints. As soon as the Reformation happens, the sheep, if they're still kept, have to be kept purely for commercial gain, not for the church. Most of the people who are involved in running the church building are that their positions are simply axed; they don't exist anymore. Within that context, now we've only got that one set of records there, but within that context, I wonder to what extent you think Protestantism has within it the seeds of its own downfall, because it completely secularizes what goes on and separates church from the rest of life in too much of a radical way.
Thank you for your question. Alan.
Well, you did say where you're coming from, and I think that is important. There's a huge debate about the nature of the English Reformation, which you'll not be surprised to hear is divided essentially along Catholic and Protestant lines. I think we're now emerging out of that debate and getting a better perspective on it. There was for a long time the assumption, this was the historiography associated with that doyen of English Reformation historians, Geoffrey Dickens, that the Protestant Reformation came along and by the sheer power of its intellectual appeal swept people off their feet as they realized they were saved solely through being born again in their relationship with God, this Lutheran principle that Simeon was talking about. And that this carried all before it, and England became overnight, almost as soon as Mary became queen, became a Protestant country. As people like Jack Scarisbrick and Eamon Duffy has emphasised, that simply didn't happen. That it was much messier and much more complicated. And what they've emphasised is the way in which the Reformation swept away all the kind of rich, colourful, touchy-feely medieval piety of the Roman Catholic Church, and replaced it with a very stark and unyielding word-based piety, where the individual was left face-to-face with his own salvation and the community was swept away. I think that's what you're referring to partly when you produce this image in Morbath of what happened after the Reformation. I think both of those are caricatures. Both the Protestant view of what happened at the Reformation and Eamon Duffy's rather Catholic view of what happened at the Reformation. And the reality of the Reformation was always much more complex than any of those two stereotypes would lead you to believe. And above all, the Church of England, in all its wonderful, manifest, complicated messiness, was always more complicated than that. And we can see within the Church of England today how both those traditions, the Geoffrey Dickens, if you like, tradition of evangelical Protestantism, you might call it, and the Eamon Duffy tradition of a high kind of beauty of holiness piety, a high church tradition, both of those are reflected in the Church of England today. So the answer is that one wasn't swept away by the other, but as always, the reality of church life was much more complicated and much more integrated than perhaps it survived whatever happened in the Church of England from the pre-Reformation to the post-Reformation.
I see David Daring nodding, so
I agree with everything Alan has said. I just have a couple of things to add. If you're interested in the argument Protestant, the seeds of its own demise, secularization, so on and so forth, there's a relatively recent book that came out by Brad Gregory arguing along these very same lines. So that's point one. Point two, I was at a conference few years ago now about Catholicism in the English Reformation, so on and so forth, where Eamon Duffy stunned the crowd by admitting very frankly the following, that if Mary, Queen Mary, had killed her half-sister, Elizabeth, when she had the chance, it would have been a good thing for us. Stunned. But he's basically saying it out there. He's like, this is my perspective. Third thing, if you want probably the most judicious account of the Reformation in England, or better still, the Reformations in England, there is a brand new book coming out this month by Peter Marshall at the University of Warwick He's a Catholic, he's a believing Catholic, but he is, I think, probably the best historian of the Reformation of his generation, at least on this island. And he's a believing Catholic, but he's incredibly judicious, very even-handed, and it's with Yale University Press.
Alan, you want to?
Could I just briefly add to that, going back to your introduction, Tom, where you mentioned Luther pinning the 95 Theses to the Schlosskirche.
I said that is part of the memory. I was very cautious.
You're absolutely right. Peter Marshall has another book coming out this year called 1517, where he analyzes the posting of the 95 Theses and comes to the firm conclusion that they weren't posted on the church door. And if you happen to go to Wittenberg in this 500th anniversary year to look at that church door, I would warn you that the church was destroyed in the 7 Years' War in the 18th century, so it's not the same church door, okay?
And there's someone over here.
Thank you very much for these insights. I'm learning lots already. I suppose I have a question for Dr. Professor or Professor Dr. Knight, if I may. I was interested in what you were saying about the Ladybird books. I remember them myself, and I'm struck by how all of us who teach the Reformation have an awesome responsibility to teach it in, I suppose, the right way rather than the wrong way. And my 9-year-old daughter is just now being introduced to the Reformation within the English Reformation context in her history lessons. It's often seemed strange to me that we don't teach up to, say, 18, the Reformation in theology lessons. It's kind of limited to history lessons. And I suppose I'd be really interested to know from you guys what your perceptions are of students who come to you and what preconceptions they have, and what you think of the state of the way the Reformation is being taught at the moment, and whether you'd improve how it's being taught.
Well, is it being taught, really? I'm not aware that it features in a great number of A-level history syllabuses. So my perception is that a lot of students are fairly ignorant about it, and some of them have picked up a variety of what one could term strange prejudices. I was speaking to one student actually yesterday who had announced in her dissertation that she was leaving. She was a Roman Catholic, she said, but I'm leaving all my prejudices at the door. So I said, great. She wrote this. And she then proceeded to launch into the 16th century and the various terrible nature of Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and everything that followed. So I wasn't convinced actually that much learning, there was a lot more learning that needed to be done. But of course it is a very complicated topic for people to teach, I guess. It does require, it's so heavily contested and there's so much excellent stuff written that if one is going to be fired up as a teacher to really invest time in this, it's going to be very rewarding, and I'm sure it's going to be very useful in terms of teaching. But I suspect that lots of teachers don't have the time or the inclination to do it.
Alan.
Having taught the Reformation for 25 wonderful years in Durham and here to successive cadres of students, it is the most fantastic thing to teach, because you have to become hermeneutically self-aware. You have to know where you are coming from and how that affects the way in which you view the Reformation. This applies, as we've seen in history with people like Eamon Duffrey and Geoffrey Dickens, it applies above all in theology, where hermeneutical self-awareness is what we have all to be about. And watching bad students and good students tackling the Reformation is such fun. And watching some of them say, that is terrible, I will not change my ideas, as Francis is talking about, and above all, watching the ones who say, gosh, that's different to what I expected, I have to confront that in me, in the history, work out what's going on, and change my ideas. As a teacher, watching students change their ideas of something that's happened in history, change their ideas, how they respond to it, that's what teaching is all about. It is so sad that this doesn't feature in the A-level syllabus, and you're absolutely right. Get rid of Hitler and bring back the Reformation.
And can I point that question a little bit more? And that is, I've been teaching the history of theology, like yourself, for 25 years, and confronting difficulties in the history of theology, people who will say, oh, history is just past, they'd almost adopt the Henry Ford, history is bunk, it's not worth 10 cents. When they discover that the history isn't as neat as they would like it to be, they feel threatened by it, and they become, history becomes more threatening sometimes than the actual doctrinal idea.
I'm an Irish historian. History is very threatening. It threatens your identity, what you are and who you are. It's much more exciting being a historian in Ireland than it is in England. I mean, history in England, I always say, is a matter of people in coloured cardigans on TV talking about Henry VIII's wives. History in Ireland is about being shot dead because you're a Catholic or a Protestant.
Okay, can you pass the mic?
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much to all of you. And this issue of the Protestant-Catholic divide has arisen, and I think what is so helpful is to go back to Luther and see how Catholic he was. And many people, in the evangelical movement think he was a conservative evangelical. He was not. It was actually from Luther that biblical criticism ultimately emerged. So I think, first of all, seeing the Catholicity of Luther, so he would object when, was it Karlstadt was celebrating communion in a lounge suit, so this is actually impossible. And the other point, just going to Elizabeth I, I mean, I'm appalled by what Eamon Duffy said, absolutely appalled. And I'd actually say this, I think the genius of Elizabeth I was to have a church where you actually had the Protestant and the Catholic together in a sense. So she had Catholic musicians, court musicians. And I think one of the wonderful things about the Church of England is that you have this mixture of the Protestant formularies, so it's absolutely clear in the 39 Articles of justification by faith and so on, but you also have this wonderful Catholic element. And I'm not a historian, I'm a poor theologian, but I guess, yes, that's right, but I guess that Elizabeth I was absolutely fundamental in forming the Church of England we now have.
Well, which of you are going to take on Richard's question?
I'll take up the second half. Elizabeth I, or better, the Elizabethan regime and the Elizabethan reign being fundamental to the Church of England as it is now. Agreed. I think that for a long time, the variety of experience and the vitality of the English Catholic community during the reign of Elizabeth, for a long time that I think was understudied, or it was seen as a subject of study only for English Catholics. But I think that in the last, say, 5-10 years even, historians of various confessional stripes, or no confessional stripes, are now looking at the English Catholic community under the reign of Elizabeth and into James, and taking a look at that community as not necessarily separated from the rest of the nation, right? And it's not just about recusant history, right? It's about being both Catholic and English, and being involved in the very fabric of the nation, of the goings-on, and so on and so forth. And so John Bossie's great book about the English Catholic community, that was a good starting place several decades ago. But I think now, the way the historiography is shaping, or is moving, offers a lot of new and interesting avenues for exploring how the English Catholic community could coexist to some extent, maybe even collaborate with the state that was defined in opposition to them. Right? In fact, one of my own PhD students is looking at the English Catholic community during this period, and I think there's a lot of good stuff that's coming out of there.
So, I mean, for Elizabeth, I wasn't so much thinking of the Catholic community, but the fact that she had, William Byrd, Catholic musician, in her court, and so you've got this sort of contradiction perhaps within Elizabeth, but actually it actually worked out rather well, because it meant that the Church of England could go forward and keeping those, should we say, Catholic traditions together with, Protestant confessions.
And if you can unravel the mystery that is Elizabeth and the enigma of her own theology, that will shake the world. So please write that big fat book. That'd be wonderful to read.
And of course, some of us are old enough, certainly myself and Alan are old enough to remember 1983 when we were celebrating 500 years of Luther's birth. And there was the big, almost a torrent of books came out in German at that time, emphasizing that you had to read Luther in the context of his background, that it didn't, he emerges out of the Devotio Moderna. He is a late medieval piety. Now,
thank you. I'd like to ask the panel to what extent you'd agree, if at all, that the Reformation was the seedbed which allowed the Enlightenment to flower, and if so, can it be accused, therefore, of beginning the dichotomy between rationalism and religion?
It's got to be Simeon.
Simeon.
He deals with these kind of broad topics. I specialize in 1 year.
I mean, partly, and this has come up in a number of questions, and part of what makes the Reformation so interesting is that it's prone to being used as a piece in a big narrative for understanding what's happened after, or, and more specifically, I think, and this is also relates to what Alan was saying earlier about his students, but about that we construct our own identity in relation to things in the past, and this is often the case with Reformation. So we want to read all the people involved with the sheep getting fired as a function of a pernicious theology, rather than as a function of something economic or any number of other possible explanations. But what that says, and I wonder whether the explanations may be more true than the other, but the point is that we are prone to seeing the past as a way of constructing our identity. So with that in mind, I think on the one hand, it's an enormously complex question in practice. I think there is an affirmation of freedom from traditional authorities, and that combined with Renaissance interests in text study and the ability of studying primary text to critique received wisdom, that you can see as being an implicit kind of rationalism or a scientific kind of mindset and so on. On the other hand, I'm sure that there are all sorts of ways in which, so Luther himself, on the one hand, he's starting modern biblical criticism in one sense, and another, he's talking about the devil all the time in very literal terms. And so in practice, it always gets quite complicated. It's hard to imagine modernity in its current form without the Reformation, but to say that the Reformation is the issue rather than any number of other factors along the way, I think is just too simple.
Alan.
Yeah, I'd be wary of saying that the Reformation led to modernity. It's not post hoc propter hoc. That modernity is a whole slew of very complicated things flowing out of the Enlightenment. What I would say is don't overestimate the radical, secularizing, reforming view of the Reformation, because as David emphasized, what the Reformation did was tried to set down all these truths in confessions, tried to set those confessions in concrete, and then try and hold people to those confessions later. So actually, when you look at, say, the Calvinist side, the Reformed side, they're still trying 400 years later to escape from the Westminster Confession, with the statement that the Pope is that man of sin, Antichrist. I mean, what on earth do you do with all these Reformation confessions that try and claim the same status as the creeds of the early church? But they aren't. They're products of their time, and you have to now move beyond and go beyond them. And that does lead to one of the things which I think we do need to look at, which is the attempt to get beyond the Reformation by such modern ventures as the Lutheran Catholic dialogue, which has reached an agreed statement on justification, for instance, and also on the Anglican side, the Anglican Roman Catholic International Committee, which has ARCIC, which has tried since the 1970s, is now in its third series of meetings, to establish common ground between Anglican and Roman Catholic as a way of escaping from the 39 Articles with their condemnation of the sacrifice of the Mass as blasphemous, and the Council of Trent with all those anathemas that David mentioned. So the Reformation isn't necessarily a forward-looking, modernizing, Tilloch's Protestant principle. It isn't necessarily like that. It could be like that if you interpret it in a particular way, but the way the Reformers set all these things in stone is actually a severe hindrance to future progress.
Francis.
Well, David Bebbington's work on the links between evangelicalism as a product emerging from the Enlightenment is interesting and suggestive, but I would be as cautious as all my colleagues in making the big causal links, Reformation, therefore Enlightenment. It strikes me, obviously, that the Enlightenment happens all over Europe in places that experience the Reformation in different ways. And it's a bit like, wanting to attribute lots of good things to the Reformation. So, things like the increase in literacy, making these sorts of huge leaps. So I would be wary, I think, Terry, of that going down your particular path.
And if an early church person can come in here, one of the interesting things that distinguishes creedal statements from the late Middle Ages Reformation period from what become the great creedal statements of the early period is, of course, the invention of the writing desk. The early ones are actually, you effectively pick whatever is the local liturgical tradition, and you then just say, well, we all say that, don't we? Well, then, if we all say then that, then we can agree on it. And so they just adopt creedal statements that are already familiar and ambiguous from liturgy. Whereas, of course, once you get the writing desk, you actually start thinking in a different way as you start creating a written statement. And so you end up with the weakness always of a proposition, that a proposition is as good as the propositions on either side of it and has to be reacted to as a proposition.
So the divisions of the Reformation are caused by the invention of the writing desk.
I'm not against writing desks, because I'm also aware that the modern academic who emerges in Bologna sometime at the end of the 11th or early 12th century is also a product of the invention of the writing desk, and I'm one of them.
All right. Yeah, thank you. Luther had plenty to say concerning which books should and shouldn't be included in the biblical canon, and even perhaps which canonical books were to be considered more important, less important, and so on. How do you feel this has impacted on the Protestant view of the canon of Scripture today, especially perhaps with regards to evangelical Christianity?
It's funny because I'm supervising your dissertation on this subject, so but I'll give it a try. Thank you.
Every word he says.
Thank you, Annie. Well, I think there are a couple of things. There's this fame. I often hear, and specifically, actually, just very concretely, people who trained in evangelical American seminaries. The thing they learn about Luther and the Bible is that he said that James was the epistle of straw. And I remember someone telling me that was the only thing they learned. And I was like, that's actually really, really problematic and manipulative, because that statement is taken out of context. It misses the fact that Luther actually didn't remove James, even though he was willing to remove the Apocrypha. And it's mostly a one-off, though I'm hoping you'll help me find more places where he talks about it. And so it does speak to a kind of willingness to question everything. And as Ernst Käsemann once said that everyone has a canon within the canon in terms of how they interpret the Bible, and people really don't like that idea, but there's a bit of Luther was more upfront about that. He said, well, there are certain things that are more valuable than others because they're closer to the gospel, and that doesn't mean it's not all scripture. And that's competing in his thought with an idea that any scripture that's proclaimed through a law-gospel hermeneutic in a public context is the external word through which the Holy Spirit alone really reliably works. And that can be true of almost any text in the whole thing. So I think he's quite complicated, in fact, on that issue. But I think it became intolerable, because if you're even questioning the canon every generation, just like every doctrine is being questioned every generation, then your scripture principle isn't a principle at all. And so I think that one sort of solidified relatively fast, at least in the magisterial reformers. It's a really interesting question.
I have a question for Dr. Knight. Something you said which is very interesting in your kind of opening comments was that you see less manifestations of Protestant-Catholic divide in younger generations of Brits. And I just wondered if you could perhaps speak a little bit about what factors may have led to that. What does that mean for kind of contemporary behaviour, debates about church, trends in young Christianity, and where could you see that going forward?
One of the things which I found most striking in the however many years it is that I've been teaching is the shift in students' sense of denominational identity amongst the Christian students that we have. Obviously we have some who are Christians and some who are not. But amongst the Christians, the thing which strikes me very forcibly is that denominational identity is now almost disappearing. And I've noticed that particularly since I've been working in Nottingham, actually. So that means that actually trying to explain some of this stuff becomes increasingly complicated because people don't naturally understand the language, the terminology, the history, nor do they find it particularly important or compelling. So obviously what we're seeing amongst those who are identifying as Christians is often identification is with the independent churches, the big churches in Nottingham. The other thing, of course, is changes within Catholicism, obviously emerging from the 1960s onwards. So that sense that Catholics would have wanted to have studied in a Catholic environment. There was still quite a lot of that around when I was a student, actually. Protestant type students would go to King's College London, Catholic students would go to Haythrop. Very occasionally, people would go from one to the other and do a course either on Rana or on Bart. But the reality is, and although we were not particularly conscious of it, one looks back and sees that there was a very strong kind of denominational sense going on within the teaching of theology. And that thankfully now is something which has largely disappeared. So I think all of these changes actually feeding through are creating a world that's actually far less consciously denominational, both in terms of the traditional divisions within Protestantism and also the Catholic Protestant thing. I think that's not really a live debate. I'm not saying it's not completely disappeared, but I'm not saying it's not a kind of charged debate. It doesn't feel hostile in the way that it might, or difficult. Not hostile is the wrong word. But it doesn't feel difficult in the way that it might have done, I think. There's a process of mutual exploration and so on. And of course, the other point is that people who have a more conservative bent will tend to get on with people who are conservatives. You know, conservative Protestants will get on with conservative Catholics, liberal Catholics will get on with liberal Protestants and so on. So there's that sense of intermeshing, which is really very obvious. Yeah. David.
This issue reminds me of an article that's published about 10 years ago now. It was originally a Prothero lecture by Dermot McCulloch for the Royal Historical Society. It was called Putting the English Reformation on the Map. And one of his comments, it's kind of an offhand comment, but you can tell that it's genuine, is that he observed that one of the developments he's witnessed over the preceding decade or two, and he was happy with this development, was that a younger generation of historians were coming to study the Reformations in Europe, and this new generation did not have the confessional axes to grind that previous generations had had. Now, I would count myself, I probably counted myself in 2010 or 2005, and I still do now, one of this younger generation, and I have no confessional axe to grind. And on the one hand, this can be seen as a positive in that I'm interested in confessional groups of all stripes, right? I'm looking for commonalities and differences. I'm looking at different relations among the traditions, among the denominations, so on and so forth. That might be seen as a positive. But others may see it as a negative, in that maybe, and actually Francis is following on what you observed there, that maybe I don't have that innate sense of the language within one of the traditions, right? So I'm perfectly aware that there may be things that I'm simply missing about the nuances within the denomination, some things that I'm not getting because of the language, right? I wasn't brought up with it, so on and so forth. So, as with everything, there's something to be gained but something to be lost in every generation. And whether not having a confessional axe to grind is a positive or negative, it is having a significant impact on the scholarship as it's unfolding now.
And that's true of other periods, of course, not just the Reformation. That would be true for people working on the 19th century, for example, 20th century.
And anthropologically, what this is the old outsider, insider, emic, etic, you know, the different ways you have of viewing religious traditions. And the answer is, of course, there's valuable insights from both inside and outside.
Okay, thank you. Going back to Francis's point, and it's been reflected on, I've heard it reflected on a bit in some of the comments since, the Reformation as leaving Europe. If you go a few miles up the road to Scotland, it strikes me you have to turn this round, where the Reformation was very much joining an alternative European international. Whether that made the Scots more European, and whether it had reflections in the certain event 11 months ago is I will leave for other people, and I will not expect the panel to judge. But I'm just interested in the whole question that the English adopted, to a great extent, a Calvinist theology, but did not become part of a Calvinist European world. So how far did the Reformation contribute to some sort of sense of English exceptionalism, which became British and spread wider? Thank you.
Well, Linda Colley would obviously say that that's the case. I mean, her famous book now, about 25 years ago, I actually jotted the title down because I knew I would need it, Britons, Forging the Nation, 1707 to 1837, she makes the case powerfully that Protestantism is one of the things which creates Britishness. Not the only thing, but one of the things. And I think she's also made the point, which certainly other people have made the point, that as Protestantism has declined, so there has been a crisis in Britishness, which is a big topic that we could I think that needs a very careful exploration, actually. But your point about Scotland is extremely interesting and important one. I am struck by how different the Reformation is, and I'm obviously looking at this as a non-specialist, but how different the Reformation is in Scotland, and how, you know, parallels there are with Holland and Switzerland and so on, and not with England.
Yes, following the question before, where you also explained that in recent time you have seen young people having, being less confessional in their confession of faith. I'm thinking also that, from the church itself, there has been, like, as you correctly say, after the 60s, like an attempt to go to the same, to a more ecumenical dialogue between Catholic and Protestant. And just to add that, recently Pope Francis actually mentioned that, he mentioned a sentence saying that what Luther wanted to do, wanted to renew the church. That's what he said. It just struck me, this sentence, showing how probably the future is changing for the relation between Catholic and Protestant.
Alan.
I think one of the things we do need to bring out is the extent to which the Reformation survived and was fueled by hatred of the other, both on the Catholic side and on the Protestant side. I study religious hatred in Ireland. I look at the powerful way in which that shaped Irish Protestants. The terror of Catholicism defined Protestantism. And that lasted right down until the 1950s and 60s. And so one of the things we have to point to here, I think, as an absolutely epochal event is Vatican II and the decree on ecumenism, because that changed fundamentally the attitude of Roman Catholics to Protestants and then Protestants to Catholics. Now, it's really interesting when you look at that. We had those wonderful early optimistic ecumenical hopes in the 1960s and 70s, and unity and union was just around the corner. That's gone by and large. Archic hasn't made dramatic progress. And now we're much more measured, we're into receptive ecumenism, and we're much more thoughtful about it, and we realize it will be slower. But what ecumenism did was get rid of the hatred. And that has gone completely from the younger generation, and that's a good thing. What they are still struggling with is that way in which the Reformation confessions still get in the way of any agreement. Doctrinal agreement has proved much more difficult than they assumed, and that is because of those Reformation roadblocks and the need to get back behind those roadblocks or beyond them. And there are two solutions. One of them is creative theology that gets back behind the Reformation roadblock, and the other one, which most young people now today are adopting, is quite simply amnesia.
Well, of course, it was Karl Rahner who famously made the point, the church is always remembering and it knows it, but of course it's always forgetting and it forgets.
Well, it's the old Irish complaint, you know, the English never remember and the Irish never forget.
One just a little kind of theological angle on that. It's something I've been ruminating on, but I think that actually it's something that informs a lot of contemporary understandings of ecumenism and perhaps some of what's going on with the students, I don't know, but certainly among academic theologians. I think a lot of these differences, confessional differences, one reason why they're not nearly as important, partly it's the ecumenical history and so on, but it's partly because I think that most academic theologians in mainstream universities are universalists de facto, without necessarily articulating it. The question of salvation is not an urgent question in contemporary theology in the way that it was for much of the period in which these things were going on. Because obviously these things suddenly matter if someone's, you can tell yourself, this matters enormously because your soul is at stake. But no one really thinks that souls are at stake very much anymore. A lot fewer people, certainly in the academy. And I wonder how that informs how we think about these things and the lessening of interest, but also of we're able to be a little bit more generous and ecumenical. Just a thought I've had.
And also, of course, death is usually less sudden.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I think Simeon's just picked up on part of what I wanted to actually say. We've said that schools are not teaching Reformation as much, and that there is a lessening maybe of denominational identity, I think, Francis, you said. And with Simeon having talked about people being interested in soteriology and universalism, I wondered whether all that together was leading to maybe not new creedal statements, but a change in practice and belief, and maybe even a blurring slightly between inside and outside.
Just by way, before Simeon answers the question, I would just say that I think there is always in ecumenism an enormous gap between what churches officially have to think and what's actually going on the ground at the lay level. The advances in ecumenism at parish level, in my parish here in Nottingham, in parishes in Ireland that I know, is fantastic. I mean, shared communion, terrible. And that is not reflected in any way in what, say, the Catholic Church says, but it's actually happening on the ground. So the people are in many respects ahead of the churches, and according to Simeon, the theologians are not far behind.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, certainly I'm struck by, that I spent a lot of time thinking about these debates about salvation, especially about participation and theosis. Those of you who are involved in theology know that these are topics that come up over and over and again, and seeing theosis, the kind of traditionally Eastern Orthodox idea of salvation in Luther, this kind of thing. And that point in particular came directly out of an ecumenical dialogue between the Finnish Lutheran Church and a particular Orthodox set of churches. But there's also that it's resulted in a lot of creativity and the unleashing of the resources of the past, of the patristic era, and of the various traditions, so that Protestants can become interested in these topics now, and that kind of thing. But at the same time, what appear to be debates about salvation are often really debates about ecumenism, because actually no one's really that worried about salvation itself.
I think one of the members of the seminar is going to pick up on your point.
Thank you. Yes, Tom pointed at me, and I thought, oh, why is he pointing at me? But it relates to something that we were talking about in the pub last night, actually. And the other
we were
thing,
actually talking about theology for nearly
we
4
were.
hours.
We were. The other thing I should also confess to being, as well as a fan of Eamon Duffy, is an Anglican priest, and in my collection of 3 rural parishes where I currently am, the only churches in the villages are the ones that I run, so the Anglican churches. There's quite a large proportion of people who live in the village who are Roman Catholics in one of the villages. When there isn't a Roman Catholic Mass, they tend to come along to the Anglican church. There's also in one of the other villages a large contingent of Baptists who come to they all come, they receive. There's one lady who doesn't, but she's very happy to be there and comes for a blessing and clearly feels that actually in some way that neither of us have quite articulated, there is something holy about the host that she's being blessed through. So yes, on the ground now, bishops and that sort of hierarchy, of course they're aware that this goes on, of course they know, but simply on the ground it happens. Have we sorted out the doctrine of that? No, absolutely not. But maybe that matters less than the fact that it happens.
You remind me of what a naval historian said to me once, and that was, it was the eye that Nelson lost was the more useful eye for the history of the British Navy.
So salvation is still important to me. It's something I'm very much focused on, and so I can see the reason for the amnesia, especially in the, the everyday man, the everyday Christian, the everyday churchgoer, the complexities of history, not really having easy answers. And so you said something along the lines of Protestants can now sort of become interested that patristics and this history is becoming more accessible. But I guess my question is given the real nature of history, given that it's not so black and white, it's not clear cut, it's not so simple, how, as a Christian, can you connect the past, the messy church history in a relevant way, in a way it's useful to the church today? Because I've been struggling with that, and so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, who's going to be the brave one and go first? Because I think all of you should make a contribution on this one.
I'm happy to. I think it's an enormously complicated procedure. There's not a, I think contemporary theology, much of what's really interesting in contemporary theology often has to do with recovery or a redescription of things in the past rather than just some sheer conceptual move. Much of what's persuasive and interesting. And so I think there's enormous contemporary systematic theological value in close attention to history. But of course, you immediately end up with the issue of, obviously you might just find what you want to find in the history. I remember once speaking to an historian at high table who was saying, oh, well, theologian, if you are a believer, then you can't possibly be objective. You don't have an agenda. I said, oh, and you and your colleagues, none of you have agendas and the reasons you've chosen the topics and so on. But there was and he couldn't answer that particularly. I think we do all have agendas, and there's a matter of good academic practice that allows you to nevertheless be shaped by things you didn't expect to find in the past, and often that's where the creative and interesting things come from. So it's a complicated procedure, and one mustn't do it naively and just find the exact history I wanted to find, staring up at me from the bottom of the well. On the other hand, I think contemporary theology that is not historically aware is deeply problematic and often just ends up rehearsing worse versions of old arguments. So I urge you to consider, to continue with wanting to thinking through in particular cases how this might work out. But I'm not sure there's a global method that'll just answer the question. That's my view.
David.
I may regret it, but I do want to take a broader view here. Whether we're thinking about historical theology, whether we're thinking about patristics, whether we're talking about almost anything in contemporary society and how the past can be useful, right? I think that was a key you were getting at there. I think that a thoughtful deliberation and consideration of the messiness of the past, the contingency of the past, not the black and white nature of the past, us and them, but the messiness, the practicalities, right? Catholics going to an Anglican church service, then and now, right? The more we appreciate the messiness of the past, the more we can appreciate the messiness of the present. And that we don't need necessarily to conform to black and white views, whether they're political or religious or so on and so forth. Now, of course, we all want some degree of certainty in certain facets, right? But I think that insofar as most of us might recognize here in the room that life is messy, you can't plan everything, so too was the past. And so I think that if we learn from the past that there are certain things that we cannot control, that there are certain factors outside our control, so on and so forth, we can become perhaps slightly more comfortable in the present, right? And so that's maybe in the broadest sense a defense of history, right? History matters, genuine. That the messiness of the past can help us recognize the messiness of the present.
Alan.
Yeah, two reflections. One I'll just toss out and then leave. It does make you, when you think about the messiness and complicated nature of history and the present, make you despair of politicians who put issues to electorate as simple yes or no's. Secondly, and much more importantly, even less importantly, a little plea for your university theology departments. What you were talking about, I think, was the gap between what we're talking about and what ordinary people are talking about. We don't want ordinary people to solve it by amnesia. We want them to solve it by understanding the complexity and the difficulty and the interest of these topics. And the answer is theology departments. I am a historian by training who went through a really good, solid, boring conveyor belt history course from there to there, each individual historian doing his own bit, never talking to anyone else. And then I arrived in a theology department, mirabile dictu. Suddenly all my colleagues were talking to each other. And I discovered that in the staff room, as a church historian, I was listening to these absurd systematicians perverting history, and I was correcting them, and they were telling me, no, you've got it completely wrong. And then all these strange New Testament people telling us that the Bible meant that, oh no, it didn't, it meant that. And discovering, this magical word, hermeneutics. A properly constituted theology department which brings together these various and vastly different disciplines, brings together atheists, agnostics, believers, fundamentalists, Muslims, Jews, brings them together in a single academic environment and gets them talking together, and then adds into the mix that magical raising agent, the students, where the students are listening to these absurd views of Dr. Bell and the absurd views of someone else, and are questioning them themselves, responding to you, telling you what someone else said in their lecture, and that, where are you coming from, Professor Ford? Because you're obviously coming from here, he's coming from there. That is the complexity of real life, the messiness of history, the messiness of theology, the messiness of being an academic, which is why it's so wonderful, and it's why teaching students in a theology department is absolutely fabulous.
Thank you. I wonder if the panel could comment on the impact of a post-truth society and how that would impact on interest or concern about the Reformation. I know Francis said there about a sort of convergence of traditional Catholics and traditional Protestants, and I think could that be in part that they both believe in truth and that the opposite will be false, as opposed to a sort of more dialectical synthesis or...
To go back to the earlier question, I think, I suppose I've been in this game so long, I don't actually regard this messiness problem as a problem. I just think the present is messy, the past was messy. You know, all of us, not just us who are actually paid to do this kind of thing, but all of you, I hope, will go out back to wherever it is you have come from and be kind of evangelists for complexity, actually. Just try to help other people to understand that history isn't black and white, theology isn't black and white. I'm not sure about terms like post-truth. That's not sort of language I'm sort of into particularly. But just help people to understand all those shades of grey. I think that if you can do that, you are doing a fantastic service to humanity.
On post-truth, I mean, isn't it amazing that Donald Trump and his right-wing allies are, in fact, postmodernists? And do they know that they're postmodernists? And this bizarre belief that any narrative is possibly true. I would offer you as an antidote to that the recent film Denial, which, as some of you will have seen, was about David Irving's attempt to deny that the Holocaust exists. And it happened, and his suing Penguin Books over the claim that he was a Holocaust denier, and he lost. And the film is nice, but conveys only a tiny amount on the surface there. What you have to do is read Richard Evans' book, which he was the historical consultant. He spent 2 years of his life picking through with his research assistants David Irving's books and pointing out the fundamental errors that he made in his survey of the Holocaust, and the fact that he wasn't an objective historian because every single error he made erred in the favour of Hitler not knowing about the Jews' fate and not ordering it. So therefore he was in fact biased, he was not a proper historian. What that is about you can't choose your facts. There are certain facts which historians, when they get round a table and argue between each other, will, even though they can't obtain objective truth, will eventually roughly agree on, and that is some kind of truth which we have to respect. Take the Holocaust whenever people deal with alternative facts and postmodernism and say, what's your attitude? Can you take it or leave it? Can you say some believe, some don't? No, of course. It happened. 4, 5, 6 million Jews were killed. That is an historical fact. That's what history is about.
Okay, the time is moving on, and I know that we have a string of questions, and I've already put up a notice saying no more questions. Let's go, quick.
Goodness, it's actually quite a big question, but...
Okay, try it.
I'm just aware much of our reflections have been perhaps Eurocentric, certainly kind of the Western world centric. And that makes sense because the Reformation obviously happened in Europe, but has had huge consequences for the rest of the world. And so I wondered if perhaps, to keep it short, maybe one, two, could just say something about the challenges of the Reformation around the world, beyond Europe, I'll leave it at that.
It's another very complex question because of the ways in which what happened in the West has affected other places. I just, as by way of an anecdote, and I don't quite know what it means, but I embarrassed myself thoroughly while teaching a course at a seminary in Hong Kong by assuming what I'd been taught, which is that guilt is a Western thing and shame is more of a Chinese thing. And I thought I knew a little bit about these things. I'm married to a Chinese woman, was living in a house full of only Chinese people. And I said, so when we got to talking about justification, I was like, I know this maybe sort of isn't as relevant. And they're all like, what are you talking about? That's why I'm a Christian. All these Chinese first or second generation converts. Now that's complicated because their whole sense of what Christianity is, they're reading textbooks mainly by American evangelicals who are shaping from very early on how they're construing Christianity. Nevertheless, but I was truly embarrassed that no one thought that this was that interesting of an insight. And the people who told me that had all been Westerners. So there's a complexity there that I'm still trying to kind of parse.
And of course, there is an interesting thing. We always talk about the division of that church at the Reformation. But of course, it would be far better to say it's the division of the Latin Church. And bear in mind that there's the Coptic Church, the church that speaks the various forms of Ethiopian, the Greek Church, the Armenian Church, the Russian Church. In a way, it's the division of already just a little section of the Catholica.
Right, thank you. It has been noticed since 1950s or 60s, the attendance in the church has dropped very drastically. Theologians have been talking about believing without belonging or belonging without believing, etc. Especially the youngsters, young people, their trend to go to church has dropped a lot. Is there any need to reform doctrine of Christianity or doctrine of God, or in a way which is more conducive to this modern time, especially to the youth? I would like if the panel would like to comment on it.
Well, isn't it always happening? I mean, isn't doctrine always reshaping itself and being expressed in different ways? And it's been going on since the 1960s. And then there'll be a reaction against it. It's whether it will actually work in terms of getting more people to go to church is another matter, of course. But it's a process that's been going on since John Robinson published Honest to God, I think.
And I think that's the thing we haven't actually mentioned that much, and part of why, another reason why maybe some of these confessional divides are less salient than they once were, is because with this massive overall decline in church going and belief and so on, that anyone who's still actually cares theologically about these things feels more affinities maybe with someone who a few generations ago were on the far side, and there's complexities there, but certainly with the rise of these sort of interdenominational Christian groups with which people affiliate rather than with an historic denomination, I think you see some of that.
I'd like to wind it up with one very unfair question, and the bravest of you will be the one who answers it. I'm on the upper deck of a bus, probably in Clapham, and I see written up on a wall that this is the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. And I turn to you, and by some means I know that you just happen to know about these things. Why bother? Why study it?
What age are you?
I'm the sunny side of 50. No, I unfortunately am not, but I'm asking you this as someone, I'm asking you this as a 40-year-old who just happens to know, I see the book you're reading, and I say, what's all this Reformation 500? What's the big deal?
How much time do you have?
About 30 seconds.
Are you Irish?
No, I'm not. I'm just an ordinary person on the Clapham Omnibus.
If you're Irish, it'd be much easier.
All right, you're on.
Your 30 seconds are up.
You've got 30 seconds. I know this is unfair, but this is.
Have you ever been to a different country?
Yes.
Did you enjoy yourself?
Yes.
Did you enjoy learning about that different culture?
Yes.
Would you like to know more about your own culture but a different time?
Yes.
Reformation.
Wonderful. Fabulous. David, that's the best answer. I was going to say that your statement, it was messy in the past and so it's messy in the present, was the most quotable line from this seminar. But that's the best answer I've ever heard.
Or whether I was brave or foolish.
Simeon Zahl, Francis Knight, David Gehring, Alan Ford,